Imagine a hospital where thousands of lives were lost amid the despair of an incurable disease. A dark tunnel that carried bodies for a long time, but left behind echoes of suffering that many believe still wander the corridors. Or a Victorian mansion marked by family tragedies and hauntings, where each door can hide a secret. And what about a mysterious triangle in Alaska, where more than 20,000 people just disappeared without explanation? Ready to explore stories that challenge logic and cause chills? Press play and get ready for a journey through the darkest mysteries of America. Waverly Hills Sanatorium's tragic history. I've always been a bit skeptical about haunted places. For me, it was more marketing or exaggeration than anything else. But last month, me and two friends decided to take a different trip. One of them suggested we visit the Waverly Hills Sanatorium, which is in Louisville, Kentucky. He knew that the place was famous for being one of the most haunted in the United States. I confess that I was more interested in historical curiosity than the supernatural part. Getting there, the building really impresses. It is a gigantic, old structure that seems to carry the weight of everything that happened there. When we entered the night tour, the guide explained that more than 60,000 people died inside during the peak of tuberculosis. Listening to that while we were looking at the dark corridors was uncomfortable, but I still thought it was a good story to scare tourists. Right away, the air looked different inside. It had a strange smell, a mixture of mold with something I could not identify, and was incredibly cold, even being a hot summer night. The guide took us through several areas of the sanatorium, but what really stuck me was the so-called death tunnel. For those who do not know, it was a tunnel used to transport the bodies of patients who died. Thus, they prevented the other patients from seeing the number of dead and losing hope. When we got to the entrance of the tunnel, the atmosphere was even heavier. I swear it wasn't just imagination. The air seemed thicker, if that makes sense. As the guide spoke, I began to hear a low sound, almost like footsteps coming from the bottom of the tunnel. Thought it was some other group, but he assured us that we were the last of that night. My inner skeptic began to falter. We continued the visit and soon arrived at the 5th floor, which the guide mentioned being the most infamous place in the building. He told the story of room 502, where they say a nurse took her own life in the 30s. According to him, she would be desperate after discovering an out-of-wedlock pregnancy, something extremely stigmatized at the time. As soon as he finished speaking, one of my friends said that he felt a strange shiver, as if something was touching his shoulder. I laughed, thinking he was trying to get in the mood, but a few seconds later, I felt something similar on my left arm. It was like a light touch, but undeniable. I looked around, hoping to see some insect or even a loose thread of clothing, but there was nothing there. After that, we started exploring the floor on our own, while the guide waited in the main corridor. It was when things really got weird. One of the rooms had a broken mirror, with only a small part still reflecting. When I passed in front of him, I had the clear feeling that something was moving in the reflection, but not in the environment around me. It was as if a shadow had passed behind me. I called my friends, but none of them had seen anything. One of them took his phone to try to record, but for some reason the camera just didn't focus on the mirror. The screen was black whenever I pointed to it. I can't explain what happened there, but even today, just remember, I get chills. We decided to leave that floor, but the mood had already changed completely. Every little noise made my heart race. We came to a corridor that seemed to lead to a kind of old living room. There were wooden chairs scattered around, and a torn old sofa in the corner. When we passed by, one of my friends suddenly stopped. He said he was sure he saw someone sitting on the couch. I looked where he pointed, but I didn't see anything. Still, that feeling of being watched became stronger. We quickly left that room, and it was when we heard a loud noise, as if something heavy had fallen upstairs. The guide came running, asking if we had done that, but we were all together. He went up to check and came back pale, saying there was nothing out of place. After that, we went downstairs where the visit was scheduled to end. The feeling of relief was almost palpable. But before we left, we passed through a last corridor where some old photos of the sanatorium were exposed. I stopped to look at a particular one that showed a line of patients being taken to the death tunnel. It was when I felt an inexplicable shiver. I swear that, for a brief moment, I had the impression that one of the figures in the photo moved. I can't explain what I saw, but I got out of there as fast as I could. Even today, when I remember that night, I feel that I brought something with me, as if the echoes of that place still followed me. On the way home, the mood in the car was strange. No one talked much, but I could tell that everyone was bothered. When I got home and went to sleep, I could not get any sleep. I kept turning in bed, with the feeling that there was someone in the room. It was as if I was being watched, but there was nothing there. This feeling accompanied me for days. Even my friends said they had been through similar things. One of them said that the TV was turned on alone at night, always on the same static channel, while the other swore that he heard footsteps outside the bedroom window, despite living on the third floor. The strangest thing happened about a week later. I was washing dishes when I heard a whisper right near my ear. I could not understand what he was saying, but the tone was clear, almost desperate. I turned so fast that I dropped a glass on the floor, but of course there was no one there. I have not heard the whispers since then, but sometimes I still feel an inexplicable shiver, as if something is with me. Don't know if I believe in haunting, but after that night at the Waverly Hills, I'm sure there's something beyond what we can understand. Death tunnel. Death tunnel. Never thought that working in the hospital would put me face to face with something so inexplicable. The existence of the death tunnel was always known because the older employees called the corridor that connected the morgue to the back of the hospital. They said it was just a more discreet way of transporting the bodies, preventing patients and visitors from getting scared. It was a cold winter night, and a power failure left the hospital half in the dark. With a lantern in hand, I entered the tunnel, feeling a cold breeze that made no sense at all in that underground construction. The lighting was poor. The emergency lights blinked, barely illuminating the peeled walls. Every step of mine echoed, amplified by the silence. My heart was beating fast, not only for the fear of being there, but for the oppressive feeling. As it advanced, the atmosphere became denser, almost as if the air was saturated with the sadness of those who had been taken there in their last trajectory. My work never involved the morgue, so that was the first time I actually went all the way. Some parts of the tunnel had a strange smell, a mixture of humidity and something indefinable, which I tried to ignore, attributing it to my imagination. Suddenly my flashlight blinked, and for a brief moment everything went dark. I ran to hit it and get the light back, but at that moment I heard something that made me freeze. A sound of rambling steps behind me. I turned quickly, the tremendous light in my hand, but there was nothing but shadows dancing on the walls. I tried to convince myself that it was only the echo of my own steps, but something inside me knew I wasn't alone. I took a deep breath, trying to control the panic that was beginning to take hold. Decide to continue, now with faster steps. The more I walked, the more the sound of the steps seemed to follow me, always a little behind, never reaching, always present. At one point, something more disturbing happened, a whisper almost imperceptible, as if someone was talking very quietly right behind me. I could not understand the words, but the voice sounded distressed, urgent. It was then that the light of the lantern caught something on the ground. I stopped to look, and my heart almost stopped. It was a small cloth doll, worn by time, with one of the eyes hanging from the line. How would she have gotten there? There had been no children in the hospital for weeks. The sight of the doll there, halfway, increased my sense of despair. It was like a warning, or worse, an invitation to something I didn't want to find. Took the doll, half without thinking, perhaps for an impulse not to leave something so sad lost in that gloomy place. Continued walking, and the suggested suggestions now intensify, as if they were trying to tell me something. The temperature in the tunnel fell down further, and I could see my own breath condensing in the cold air. My mind was telling me to go back, but I needed to get to the other side and end it. With each step, the fear grew inside me. I tried to focus on the exit, repeating to myself that it was just a runner, just a job to be done. But then I heard clearly the cry of a child. The sound was so clear, so close, that there was no way to deny or rationalize. It seemed to come from within the walls, a sad and frightening lament. Instinctively, I turned the lantern towards the sound, but again, there was only the void and darkness staring back at me. The crying persists, more painful now, as if the child is lost and desperate. With every step I took, the sound seemed to move, always keeping the same distance, a constant reminder that something was not right. Increasingly anxious, I accelerated the step, almost running, the doll still firm in my hand. In my mind, flashes of all the stories about the tunnel began to clump together. Reports of appearances and voices, unexplained staff disappearances over the years. Finally, I saw the light at the end of the tunnel, literally. Never a cliché seemed so comforting. But as I approached the exit, the crying suddenly stopped, replaced by a sudden and heavy silence. I stopped for a moment, hesitant, the light of day looking strangely threatening now. The silence was so deep that I could hear my own heart beating out. The sense of interval that I thought I would feel when reaching the end of the tunnel did not come. I decided to look back one last time before leaving the tunnel. The dim light of my flashlight barely penetrated the darkness behind me, but it was enough for me to see something move quickly to the side, as if avoiding being caught by the light. My whole body shivered at the sight, and without thinking I ran out of the tunnel, emerging into the daylight with panting breath and a pounding heart. From the outside, the world looked the same, but I was changed. The doll was still with me. Now I pressed it against my chest as if it were a talisman. I looked at her, trying to find some logic, some sense in what I had experienced. But nothing made sense. I was outside the tunnel, but the feeling that something had followed me permanently, a feeling of invisible glances over me, of unspoken words whispering in the wind. I walked back to the main hospital building, trying to convince myself that what I had experienced was the result of stress or my fertile imagination. However, the feeling of fear and the weight of events in the tunnel did not dissipate. When I entered the hospital, some colleagues noticed my pale appearance and asked if I was okay. I answered yes, avoiding to tell anything about the tunnel. Who would believe? I can hardly believe it myself. I decided to keep the doll in my drawer at work, as a silent reminder of what had happened. In the days that followed, I tried to resume my routine, but the tranquility was superficial. At night, vivid and disturbing dreams with the tunnel came to haunt me. In them, I was back there listening to the steps, the suggestions, the crying. And each time, a doll appears in different places, always watching me with his eye hanging, as if he had information of something I did not know. These dreams made me restless, and exhaustion began to take hold of my days. I tried to talk with colleagues about the tunnel, looking for some kind of validation or explanation that made sense. Some laughed, others became serious and confessed to feel a strange energy as they passed by there, but no one had experienced anything so intense as what I described. I need answers, so I decided to do something that I swore I would never do again. I went back to the tunnel. This time I went during the day, thinking that the sunlight could drive away the shadows and fears of the previous night. But as soon as I entered, the temperature dropped, as if the tunnel itself rejected me. I walked the full path again, this time without interruptions or sounds, only the echo of my steps and the accelerated pulse of my heart. Coming to the end, nothing unusual happened, but the feeling of feedback that I expected to feel again was gone. Coming out of the tunnel for the second time, something inside me changed. I found nothing tangible to explain my previous experience, but the restlessness persisted. I started to research more about the history of the hospital, and especially the tunnel. I found old reports of nurses and doctors who talked about a presence in the tunnel, how they avoided going through it whenever possible, and about unexplained incidents of people hearing voices and seeing faces. With every story I read, I felt less crazy and more worried. It was clear that I wasn't the only one feeling something strange in that place. However, the concrete answers ran away from me. I decided then that it was time to leave this behind. I put the doll in a small box and buried it in a nearby park, trying to get rid of not only her, but also the memories she carried. Now, months later, I still think of the dangerous tunnel, especially at night when the world around it is quiet and dark. Logic says there must be an explanation for everything I've experienced, but a part of me knows that some things simply transcend human comprehension. Fear, cold children. All this remains with me, a constant reminder that sometimes reality is more frightening than any story. Paranormal activity at Waverly Hills. My name is Lucas, and what I'm about to tell happened on a cold autumn night in 2018. I was studying photography at university, and, always fascinated by the paranormal, decided to do a project about abandoned places with stories of haunting. That's how Waverly Hills came on my list. That old sanatorium, famous for the reports of unexplained apparitions and phenomena, was the perfect setting. At the time, I lived alone in a small apartment, spending nights at night studying or editing photos. Loneliness never bothered me. On the contrary, I always liked silence, which helped me to concentrate. But nothing could prepare me for the silence I found in Waverly Hills. I arrived there with my camera, tripod, and a powerful flashlight. The plan was to spend the night exploring and capturing anything out of the ordinary. The twilight gave a more sinister tone to the deteriorated building. The broken windows, the peeling paint, and the vegetation taking over the structures created an atmosphere of total abandonment. I started downstairs, taking pictures of the empty corridors and rooms that decades ago were full of patients fighting tuberculosis. With every click of the camera, I felt the weight of that place's history. It was as if each shadow could be hiding an untold story. As I advanced to the upper floors, the temperature seemed to fall even further, as if the building itself wanted to repel me. The 5th floor was my main goal, known for numerous reports of patient suicides. Access was harder than I thought. Stairs blocked by debris required extra effort. When I finally arrived, the environment changed drastically. A cold breeze received me at each door that opened, and the sound of my steps echoed, mixing with almost inaudible whispers. It was difficult to determine if they were real voices or just the wind passing through the cracks. I turned on my camera and started recording as I walked cautiously down the corridor. Suddenly, I heard a sound that made me stop immediately. It was like a muffled cry coming from the end of the hall. With my breath stuck, I followed in the direction of the sound, my flashlight lighting an increasingly narrow path. The crying became clearer, and as I reached the last room of the corridor, the light revealed something that froze my blood. An old wheelchair, slowly rocking as if someone invisible was still there, rocking in eternal agony. Instinctively, I raised my camera to capture that disturbing scene. The viewfinder trembled slightly with my wrist, and the click of the camera seemed to break some kind of sacred silence. It was then that an inexplicable cold passed me, like a wave, leaving me covered with shivers. I knew I was no longer alone. The feeling of being watched was almost palpable. I decided that I needed to see more, investigate more deeply, despite the fear that was beginning to take hold. Continued to film, moving slowly down the corridor. As I went on, an even stranger phenomenon began to occur. My camera, a high-quality DSLR digital single-lens reflex, began to fail. The images are blurry and distorted, and at times the screen just blinked, as if something or someone did not want to be recorded. Frustrated and increasingly nervous, I decided it was time to go back, but when I turned to return, a dark figure quickly crossed the corridor behind me, caught only by the corner of my eye. After seeing the face quickly cross, my heart shot, and a sense of urgency overcame me. Without thinking twice, I ran in the opposite direction, feeling every shadow and every whisper intensify around me. It was as if, in trying to capture images of that place, I had awakened something, or perhaps just become more aware of the haunting reality of Waverly Hills. Arriving at the end of the corridor, I breathed relieved to see the light of the exit in the distance, but my relief was brief. Just as I was approaching the stairs, I heard a shrill noise coming from all sides, as if the walls themselves were screaming. The intensity of the sound was such that I had to cover my ears. It was then that I realized my camera, hanging from the neck, was recording everything, even if I did not remember having pressed the record button again. Desperate to get out of there, I went down the stairs as fast as I could, the camera still swinging on my neck. The daylight seemed a blessing as I emerged from the building, breathing deep in the fresh morning air. In the parking lot, I looked back one last time at the huge sanatorium, feeling a mixture of relief and disbelief for what I had experienced. When I arrived home, my curiosity overcame the fear. I connected the camera to my computer, eager to see what I had captured, especially the moment captured automatically. The video file showed my quick escape, but what really froze my blood was the sound captured. Next to the shrill noise, there was a voice, low but clear, repeatedly saying, "Don't go out." It was a voice I had not heard while there, which made everything even more frightening. From that day on, my relationship with photography and the paranormal changed radically. I still feel an attraction for abandoned places and their forgotten stories, But now there is always a hesitation, a fear of invading spaces that should perhaps remain untouched. Waverly Hills has left a mark on me, a reminder that there are phenomena in this world that are beyond our comprehension and possibly our reach. I shared the video and my experiences in online forums, seeking to better understand what happened. I met others who had similar experiences, and that somehow brought a little comfort, knowing that I was not alone in this experience. However, the voice in the video still haunts me, and I often catch myself wondering if I should have listened to the warning and never left Waverly Hills. Secrets and fears of the beyond. I was always skeptical about ghost stories and hauntings until I decided to visit the Waverly Hills Sanatorium, driven more by curiosity than belief. It was October 2020, and I was in a phase of life where I was looking for something that gave me the adrenaline, something outside of my daily work as a remote programmer. Waverly Hills always appeared in conversations and TV shows as one of the most haunted places in the world, and I wanted to see for myself if there was any truth in it. I arrived at the sanatorium just before dusk. The immense building, with its broken windows and exposed bricks, stood ominously against the sky that quickly darkened. The feeling of abandonment was palpable, and a cold breeze made the cold air penetrate to the bones. I began my exploration downstairs, where the echo of my own steps in empty hallways seemed to follow the fast-paced rhythm of my heart. It was just me, my camera, and a flashlight that seemed increasingly ineffective as the darkness took over. As the night fell, the atmosphere in the sanitarium became increasingly oppressive. Went up to the second floor, where reports of paranormal activities were more frequent. Every step he took seemed to echo through the empty corridors and desolate rooms. My goal was to get to the famous fifth-floor corridor, but something on the second floor caught my attention. A soft tapping sound, almost as if someone or something was knocking at one of the doors along the corridor. Cautiously, I followed the sound to a specific room. The door was ajar open, and as I pushed it with my fingertips, the sound stopped abruptly. Inside the room, the air was noticeably colder, and I could see my breath basing on the beam of light from the flashlight. There was nothing there but old furniture and layers of dust. However, the silence that followed was so dense that it seemed to have weight, pressing against my ears with an uncomfortable intensity. I decided I needed to leave that room, but as I turned towards the door, a sound of scratches began to emerge from one corner. My heart was beating so fast I could feel it all over my body. The light of the lantern flickered, and for a moment I thought about running, but curiosity was stronger. Pointed the light to the corner from where the sounds came, and to my astonishment, I saw fresh marks on the wood, as if someone or something had just scratched it. There was no one but me there, and the only entrance was the door I had entered through. Taking a deep breath, I tried to keep calm and continued my exploration. Each step now seemed to resonate even more, echoing through the walls as if the building itself was alive. The decision to go up to the fifth floor was weighing me down, but I was already there, and part of me needed to see if the stories were really true. The climb up the narrow staircase was accompanied by the sound of dragging chains, a classic detail of ghost stories that always seemed cliché to me until that moment. Reaching the fifth floor, the feeling of being observed intensified. There was a heavy feeling of sadness that permeates the air, almost tangible. I knew the stories about patients who had supposedly taken their own lives on this floor. The corridor was long, and with each step a sense of despair seemed to grow. At the end of the hall, something caught my attention. A shadow quickly passed through an open door. It was a dark and distorted figure, almost as if it were floating. With my breath gripped and the camera in hand, I slowly advanced towards the door. My heart was beating so fast I feared it might disrupt the recording. As I reached the threshold, I looked into the room. It was an old treatment room, with broken windows where the moonlight came in, creating patterns on the floor covered with debris. For a moment, everything was silent, a silence that was broken only by the distant sound of the wind. And then I heard a low voice, almost a whisper, but clearly a female voice saying something incomprehensible. The whisper was soft, almost like a lament, repeating itself in an almost hypnotic way. I could not understand the words, but the emotion conveyed was clear. It was a mixture of sadness and supplication. The temperature in the room seemed to have fallen even more, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the cold air. With the camera still recording, I forced myself to stay calm and try to capture any evidence I could. Despite the fear, I felt an almost compulsive need to understand what was happening. I approached where the voice seemed to come from and, to my surprise, found a small dusty music box above one of the fallen cabinets. It was partially open, and as I approached, the music abruptly ceased and silence settled again, so intense that it almost seemed audible. The abrupt interruption of the music made me even more nervous, but my curiosity was stronger. I picked up the music box carefully, observing its old and worn appearance. The lid was decorated with a delicate engraving showing a dancer. As I tried to wind the box, something surprising happened. It started playing again, but this time the melody was distorted, almost like a lament. The sound seemed to fill the space, making the atmosphere even heavier. I put the music box back in the closet and decided it was time to leave the building. The feeling of being watched had intensified, and I didn't want to know what would happen if I continued there any longer. As I hurried down the stairs, the sense of urgency was palpable. The sound of the dragging currents seemed to follow each of my steps, accelerating as I accelerated. When I finally reached the ground floor, the feeling of relief at seeing the exit was immense. However, as I ran towards the door, a loud bang echoed behind me, as if something had fallen or been thrown hard against the ground. Without the courage to look back, I kept running until I was outside the sanitarium. Outside, the fresh night air never seemed so inviting. I stopped for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to calm my still beating heart. As soon as I got to my car, I locked the doors immediately, a safety measure that seemed necessary after all I had experienced. On the way home, the events of the night ran in my mind like a movie. Although I did not fully understand what had happened, I knew that I had experienced something extraordinary and frightening, something that challenged my previous understanding of the world. Current status as a paranormal attraction. My experience in the sanatorium, which now serves as an attraction for ghost hunters and curious about the paranormal, happened on a night of November. I never believed much in these things of spirits and hauntings, but the pressure of friends and the fame of the place convinced me to participate. I'm a systems engineer, a very down-to-earth person, and that day my logic was that it would be only an interesting night at most. Upon arrival, the guide began with stories about unexplained appearances and events that many visitors claimed to have witnessed. The building, immense and deteriorated, imposed a kind of respect mixed with a dose of fear, and even being skeptical, I could not avoid a shiver when entering. We were equipped with lanterns, and some even took special cameras to capture thermal variations, typical of paranormal investigations. The night promised to be long, and, I confess, I was beginning to feel the heavy atmosphere of the place. As the night progressed, the group deepened further and further into the dark corridors of the sanitarium. The guide made a point of stopping at certain points, telling details of patients who had passed by and how their souls could still be wandering around. I tried to maintain a skeptical stance, focusing on historical facts, but it was difficult to ignore the climate of tension that was forming. At one point, while we explored the second floor where many sightings had been recorded, something peculiar happened. We were in a narrow corridor, the light of my lantern dancing through the peeled walls, when I heard a sound that made me stop. It was a whisper, almost inaudible, as if someone was crying very quietly. At first, I thought it was someone in the group trying to play a trick, but looking around, I saw that everyone was ahead, focused on the explanations of the guide. Again I heard the sound, now a little clearer, coming from a room next to the corridor we were in. Intrigued and a little reluctant, I decided to separate myself from the group for a moment to investigate the origin of the sound. With the lantern in hand, I opened the door from where the whisper seemed to emanate. The room was empty, filled only with old hospital beds and broken windows through which the moon threw beams of silver light. The sound had ceased, and while I wondered if my mind was playing tricks on me, something even more strange happened. The temperature in the room dropped abruptly, and my breath began to form small clouds of steam in the cold air. I stood there, paralyzed for a moment, trying to rationalize the situation. It was when I heard clearly, right next to me, a voice whispering, "Don't stay here." The tone was so clear and direct that my heart popped. There was no one visible in the room with me, and the realism of the voice was such that I could not attribute it to echoes or jokes. Quickly, I left the room, seeking the comfort of the group's presence. When I returned to the group, I kept what had happened to me. Not to sound like the frightened skeptic, but the truth is that the incident shook me deeply. We continued to explore other areas of the sanatorium, including the famous fifth floor, where reports of apparitions were even more frequent. I tried to stay close to others, the light of the participants' lanterns becoming a kind of refuge from the darkness that now seemed more threatening than ever. When we reached the fifth floor, the guide took us to what was known as the solitary room, where patients with the most severe cases were isolated. Upon entering, an inexplicable cold took over the environment, and for a brief moment, everyone in the group seemed to feel the same shiver, a silent connection of discomfort and fear. There, several members of the group began to report strange sensations, such as slight touches on the back or almost imperceptible whispers, similar to what I had experienced before. The atmosphere on the fifth floor was dense, almost palpable, and each sound seemed amplified by the silence that followed it. The group's reactions varied. Some laughed nervously, trying to disguise their discomfort, while others, clearly fascinated, tried to capture any evidence with their cameras. I, on the other hand, felt increasingly restless, the memories of the whisper in the empty room still echoing in my mind. I decided I needed a moment for myself, so I moved away slightly from the group, watching the shadows dance on the walls to the taste of the light of the lanterns. It was then that I noticed a shadow moving independently of the others, as if slipping along the corridor. Rationality told me that they were tricks of the light or my imagination, but the movement was so specific and deliberate that I caught myself following the figure with my eyes, trying to discern its form or intention. Following the shadow cautiously, I noticed that it was heading for a less lit area of the corridor. My heart was beating fast, the adrenaline mixed with an almost morbid curiosity about what was happening. When I reached the point where the shadow seemed to have disappeared, there was nothing but an old wooden door half open. With a mixture of hesitation and determination, I pushed the door, revealing a small room that seemed to have been an office or treatment room. Inside the room, the temperature was noticeably lower, and a musty smell of antiques invaded the air. My instinct was to leave, but something in the back of the room caught my attention. An old diary covered with dust on a broken table. Carefully, I opened the diary, and the words written in it were from a patient who reported his visions and fears. Descriptions that looked very much like what I and others in the group were experiencing that night. The diary was full of entries detailing the patient's struggle with hallucinations, or at least that was what doctors assumed at the time. The descriptions were vivid and disturbing, talking about shadows that whisper secrets and lamentations, cold touches that pass through the skin at night. Reading those words, I felt a strange connection, as if the experiences of that patient were somehow echoing through the years, reaching me and other visitors. I put the diary back in place, feeling a mixture of respect and sadness for the author of those words. Upon leaving the room, I decided that it was enough for me. The experience had become too real, and the stories told by the guide now seemed less like folklore and more like true testimonies of something inexplicable and somehow tragic. As I rejoined the group, I noticed that the general mood had changed. We were no longer just tourists on a tour. We looked like survivors of an experience that would connect us in an unexpected way. As we briefly shared our sensations and discoveries, it became clear that I was not alone in my perceptions. Some had felt presences, others heard voices, and some, like me, found objects that seemed to have their own stories to tell. When the night finally came to an end, and we left the sanitarium behind, the silence in the bus was palpable. Each of us was immersed in his thoughts, probably trying to process what we had experienced. For me, the visit not only challenged my skeptical view of the world, but also made me reflect on the many layers of human reality, some of which may never be fully understood. And to this day, the memory of that night, especially the whisper beside me, follows me, a constant reminder that there is more between heaven and earth than our vain philosophy dreams. Franklin Castle, Cleveland, Ohio, 1881. My visit to the Franklin Castle in Cleveland, Ohio was an experience I will never forget. It all started with a casual curiosity about haunted houses, which soon turned into an obsession to find out the truth behind these stories. Franklin Castle, with its Victorian architecture and reputation as the most haunted house in Ohio, seemed like the perfect place to start. I, a graphic designer with a peculiar taste for horror stories, decided that October would be the ideal time for my visit. I arrived on a cloudy Friday afternoon, the gray sky complementing the gloomy weather that the castle exhaled. The imposing towers and arched windows of the castle seemed to observe each visitor with a Gothic intensity. As I entered, the cold air and silence of the great entrance completely enveloped me. The guide began to tell us about the many family tragedies that happened there, including mysterious deaths and reports of ghostly apparitions that did not delay in manifesting over the years. As the guide led us through dark corridors and rooms full of antiques, the atmosphere of the castle became increasingly dense. Every corner seemed to whisper forgotten stories, and the heavy velvet curtains that adorned the windows filtered light so that only faint beams lit our way. I tried to maintain a healthy skepticism, but the feeling of being watched began to grow inside me, fueled by the stories of visions of a woman in black wandering the halls and a child crying in the shadows. At a certain point of the visit, We arrived at a room that the guide described as the heart of the castle's paranormal activities. The room, with its marble fireplace and old portraits staring at us, seemed to hold the darkest secrets of the house. It was then that something unexplainable happened. While we were all gathered listening to the guide, a figure quickly passed through the door at the back of the room, only noticeable in the corner of the eye. The whole group felt a chill, and even the guide, accustomed to such reports, seemed momentarily disturbed. After the initial fright, the guide tried to reassure us, suggesting that what we saw could be only a trick of light or a reflection, but the tension in the air was palpable. I decided to separate myself from the group a little, attracted by a staircase that led to the second floor. Slowly rising, each step creaks under my weight, echoing through the almost total silence. The second floor was less illuminated, and shadows seemed to dance on the walls as my lantern crossed the space. Arriving at the upper corridor, I heard clearly the sound of straying steps on the other end. Moved by both fear and fascination, I followed the sound. With each step I took, the sound became louder and clearer. As I turned into a side corridor, I saw a door ajar from which sounds seemed to emanate. With my heart beating fast, I pushed the door carefully, revealing a dusty room with an old iron bed and a small crib next to it. The most disturbing, however, was the sound of a soft child's cry that filled the air, although there was no one visible in the room. Paralyzed by the situation, I stood on the threshold of the door, trying to discern the origin of the cry. The sound was so clear and real that for a moment I thought about going back and get someone, but something kept me there, rooted in place. The crying seemed to carry a deep, almost tangible sadness that filled the room with an atmosphere of mourning. Slowly I approached the crib in the light of my lantern, revealing that although it was empty, it was covered by a thin layer of dust, except for a small area that seemed to have been recently touched, a small and delicate handprint visible in the dust. As I watched, the surrounding air became noticeably colder, and the crying suddenly ceased, replaced by a heavy silence that seemed to carry the weight of all untold stories from that castle. At that moment, I felt a light breeze passing through me, although the windows were all closed. The hair on the back of my neck grew stiff, and a feeling of not being alone made me quickly leave the room, closing the door behind me with a soft snap. Back in the hall, the echo of my own footsteps seemed abnormally loud, as if every sound was amplified in the stillness of the castle. Quickly I went down the stairs, looking for the comfort and safety of the group. I met everyone in the main hall, where the guide finished the stories of the house. My return caught the attention of some, but I chose not to comment immediately on what I had experienced, trying to process internally first. At the end of the tour, as everyone began to disperse, I approached the guide and shared in particular my experience in the second floor room. The guide listened intently, his face holding a neutral expression, and then in a low voice he said that it was not the first time visitors reported sounds of childish crying in that part of the castle, that he mentioned that the local legend spoke of a child from the original family who had died tragically young, and that many believed his spirit still inhabited the place. Listening to the guide talk about the stories of the castle and confirm my experience without surprise, I felt a mixture of relief and restlessness. Relief to know that I was not imagining sounds and visions, but anxiety to know that the energies of that place were intensely palpable and perhaps eternally trapped there. As I left the Franklin Castle, I looked back and saw the silhouette of the castle against the sky rapidly darkening. The place had a dark beauty, almost inviting, but now knew that it was full of memories and perhaps souls who did not find rest. On the way home, my mind could not disconnect from what I had experienced. That night in the castle changed my perception of the paranormal. It was no longer just a distant curiosity. It was real, tangible, and in some ways deeply human. The story of the child and his lost tears in time touched me in a way I did not expect, and I realized that these places hold more than just fear. They hold stories of past lives, joys and tragedies that intertwine in the shadows we inhabit. Hotel Crescent, Eureka Springs, Arkansas, 1886. My visit to the Crescent Hotel in Eureka Springs began as a mixture of journalistic interest and a slight skepticism. I work with documentaries, and it has always fascinated me how historical places can accumulate not only memories, but also ghost stories that often seem more alive than the story itself. In October 2021, I decided it was time to explore the most haunted hotel in America to see for myself if these stories could withstand a more critical look. Arriving at the hotel, the grandeur of the Victorian building impressed me immediately. The tall towers and intricately decorated balconies created an atmosphere that was both inviting and somewhat intimidating. I was greeted by a cold breeze that made me wonder if it was just the autumn weather or something more supernatural. The interior decoration maintained the Victorian style, with period furniture that seemed to keep secrets of a century of guests and events. As soon as I got settled in the hotel, I decided to join one of the famous ghost tours offered every night. The guide, a gentleman with a natural ability to tell stories, led us through the corridors illuminated only by his lantern, each shadow projected on the walls seeming to take life of its own. He began by telling the story of Michael, a bricklayer who supposedly died in the hotel during construction, and many claim to still see him wandering through the corridors on the third floor. When we reached the third floor, the guide took a dramatic pause before opening the door to one of the hotel's oldest rooms. The group entered timidly. The air in the room was noticeably colder, and a subtle smell, almost like that of faded flowers, filled the room. Then something happened. As the guide describes the various appearances of Michael reported by previous guests, the room's curtains moved sharply, as if a gust of wind had come in, but the windows were firmly closed. The movement of the curtains caused a nervous murmur to lose the group. Some laughed, trying to hide their nervousness, while others, including me, watched carefully, trying to find a logical explanation. The guide, noticing the tension, lit another lantern and continued the story, mentioning that phenomena like that were common in that room, especially on the coldest autumn nights. Determined to explore more, I asked for permission to be alone in the room after the tour ended. With my recording equipment ready, I sat on the old iron bed, hoping to capture any anomaly or sound that could validate the stories heard. The silence was almost deafening, and as time passed, the feeling of being observed grew. That's when I heard, clearly, the sound of footsteps in the corridor. Slow and deliberate, the steps seemed to approach, stop before the door of the room, and then, almost imperceptibly, the handle began to turn. The breath stuck and the camera in hands. I fixed my eyes on the handle that moved slowly. There was no clapping, no abrupt entry, only the door opening gently, revealing the corridor illuminated only by the dim light of the emergency lamps. My heart was beating hard, and for a moment I doubted my own courage. But the door stopped moving, and there was no one there. I stood up slowly. The camera was still recording, and walked to the door. I looked both sides of the corridor, but saw no one. The sound of the steps had ceased completely. Returning inside the room, I felt a change in temperature. The air was noticeably colder. So I decided to sit down again and continue my vigil. Minutes passed, and the feeling of not being alone just intensified. It was then that, while reviewing the camera images to see if I had captured anything during the movement of the door, I noticed a spectral figure reflected in the mirror of the room. The figure was diffuse, almost nebulous, but the shape was undeniably human, and it seemed to be looking directly at the camera, at me. When I saw the figure in the mirror, my blood froze. The reflection was subtle, but the presence was clear and defined. I swallowed dry, trying to keep calm while it continued to shoot, hoping to capture some more evidence. My logical mind struggled to find rational explanations, but the feeling of being in front of the supernatural was undeniable. I decided that I needed to investigate the mirror more closely. With hesitant steps, I approached, the camera pointed at the glass that now seemed a portal to another reality. When I got close enough, the figure in the mirror looked sharper. It was a male silhouette, and although the details were hazy, the impression of sad eyes watching me was disturbing. The moment I focused the camera to get a clearer picture, the figure faded as if it had never been there. The surrounding air warmed up suddenly, and the room returned to normal, as if all the charged atmosphere had been just a dream. As the figure disappeared, the weight of the atmosphere seemed to dissipate, and a feeling of temporary relief took hold of the room. However, the curiosity and adrenaline that kept me inside overcame the initial fear. I sat down again, reflecting on the experience and reviewing the recordings, trying to identify if any more unexplained detail had been captured. The clock was well past midnight, and the hotel's silence seemed deeper, as if the entire building breathed in a state of forced rest. I decided to close my investigation for that night, feeling that any additional evidence I could capture would be only redundant after the phenomenon I had witnessed. As I left the room, a last look back made me feel a mixture of nostalgia and restlessness, as if I was leaving behind not just a physical location, but an intense and personal connection. I went down the stairs in silence, each step echoing in the empty corridors, carrying with me the images and sensations of a night that challenged my perception of reality. Back at the reception, the fresh morning air welcomed me as a reminder of the external reality, far from the enigma that the Crescent Hotel kept on its upper floors. As I walked out, a last look at the Victorian building made me ponder over the many untold stories these walls have witnessed. What I once considered just folklore or tourist entertainment had become a personal and unforgettable experience, which challenged my skeptical and rational view of the world. On the way back home, as I drove under the starry sky, the events of the night repeated themselves in my mind. The image of the figure in the mirror, particularly, remained vivid, like a fingerprint left on my consciousness. Knew that by sharing this story, many could question its truthfulness or dismiss it as a trick of the mind. However, for me, what I experienced was as real as any other tangible experience. A reminder that the world is vast and mysterious, and not everything can be explained or understood by logic or science.